Hello, this is Walter Edgar, back again to talk with you a little bit about South Carolina history. In our previous episode, we talked about the land, the landscape, and today we're going to talk about at least a portion of the people. Colonial South Carolina was really something of a cultural bouillabaisse, or you could say we were multicultural before that ever became cool. There were at least 10 European ethnicities, more than 40 Native American tribes or nations, and some 24 West African ethnicities, 24 West African ethnicities among the enslaved population. Today I'm going to talk about the European settlers who came to South Carolina. And look at this table. It's one that is complete except for one. I say 10 ethnicities, you see 9 here. Since this table was done and I wrote my history, we've discovered that there were Italians in colonial South Carolina in Beaufort County, part of the Swiss immigration, which most people thought was strictly French and German. But let's start with the English. The first settlers who came over on the Carolina, there were 93 of them. 90 of those were English. Now, ironically, we don't know much about those who came directly from England in this early group, but we know a lot about most of them because they were Barbadians. Now, that was a term used in South Carolina in the colonial period to describe anybody from the English West Indies, and they actually moved that on up to include Bermuda and the Bahamas, which are not West Indian, but anybody from the English islands was considered a Barbadian. Barbadian planters had long been interested in a project to move to the mainland, particularly to Carolina. The proprietors, some of them, were involved in the Barbadian planting business, but that island was completely filled up in terms of land and planting. They needed literally a place to grow food. They envisioned South Carolina to be a breadbasket for Barbados, where they just plant sugar for money. Barbados was overcrowded. This is an era of adventure and lots of land. By 1671, just within the first year of settlement, the Barbadians had been accused of trying to stage a coup to take over the colony, despite the fact that only about 300 of them here. Now, who were some of these people? From Barbados itself came Sir John Colleton, who was one of the proprietors, his brothers, James Colleton and Charles Colleton, Sir John Yeamans, who was a landgrave and a governor, Robert Daniel, Arthur and Edward Middleton, Robert Gibbs, Barnard Skinking, James Moore, later governor, and the Draytons, the Elliots, the Fenwicks, Ladsons, and Woodard. From Bermuda came William Sale, the first governor of the colony. From Jamaica came Amory's, Paris, and Pinckney. From Antigua, Lucas. From St. Kitts, Rollins and Lowndes. From the Leeward Islands, Sir Nathaniel Johnson, a governor. And from the Bahamas, Nicholas Trott, who for a while really was virtually dictator of South Carolina. Now, they were all Englishmen, but they had been seasoned in another colony. And when we talk about somebody being seasoned, that means they have lived through the first year of settlement, dealt with whatever disease is prevalent there, and they're going to make it. Well, that was true of these individuals coming from the various islands of the Caribbean and the South Atlantic. They were seasoned not just for the disease, they were seasoned in terms of knowing what it took to make a colony work. And that's why they were so important. South Carolina never went through a starving time like Massachusetts or Virginia, because the folks who came out here knew what they were doing. One small group of Englishmen who at least left a name on the map in colonial South Carolina were Puritans, and that kind of runs counterintuitive. Puritans are coming to South Carolina. Well, a congregation that had started out in Dorchester, England, moved to Dorchester, Massachusetts in the 1630s in what was called the Great Migration of Puritans to Massachusetts, picked up as a congregation and settled in South Carolina on the Ashley River in a place they call Dorchester. The town that they settled no longer exists, but that was a complete congregation move, so they added another interesting mix to the settlement. Now, when people think about who were the other European groups, everybody, oh, the French, we know about the French. Well, there are several different kinds of Frenchmen. To begin with, I want to talk quickly about the Acadians. We know about Longfellow's poem and Evangeline, what have you. But when the English took over Canada in the 1750s, they expelled French settlers from Nova Scotia. And 1,000 of them were shipped to South Carolina, a forced migration. And if you think of the world today, people didn't want migrants from certain countries. Well, the South Carolinians didn't want the Acadians. They were Roman Catholic, they were poor. Where did they fit into the colony? Within a year, a third of them were dead, and the rest of them picked up stakes and moved either to Louisiana or to Haiti. And the third group of French were French Swiss, who came a little bit later. But the most important, the one that everybody recommends, or at least remembers, are the Huguenots. And of course, when I call them Huguenots, that's the way we pronounce it in South Carolina. In France, they would be Huguenots. So I've had that conversation with native Frenchmen who say, you South Carolinians don't pronounce things the way we would. Well, this isn't the only case. We always pronounce things our way, and the rest of the world can just get used to it. Now, the background for the Huguenot migration has to do with the religious wars in France. The Huguenots were a large minority of the population, and they began to come out to South Carolina in the 1670s. This is before their religion was outlawed in 1685 with the revocation of allowing them to worship as they chose in France. So they were already coming out here, but once that edict was put in place in 1685, there was a flood of Huguenots coming to South Carolina for religious freedom, but also for land. You got to remember, if you own 50 acres of land in England or France, you were pretty rich. Out here, remember, you could get, if you came out with your wife and an adult child, you could get 150 acres. So you could become a lord of the manor, at least you'd think you would, in European terms. Now, what is interesting, when the Huguenots got to South Carolina, they weren't received all that well, because they were a minority. They were French speaking, and of course the French have always, and the English have never really gotten along. Lots of pejorative terms, which we don't say today, were used in the 17th and 18th century when referring to the French. But what attracted them to South Carolina was the fact that under the fundamental constitutions of Carolina, anyone who believed in God could settle in South Carolina. So they could worship, excuse me, they could worship according to their own beliefs here in the colony. Now, because the settlers, the English settlers, weren't real wild about him, they pushed the Huguenots to the northern frontier, away from Charleston, along the Santee River. And ironically, of course, what they did is they put the Huguenots in a dangerous situation vis-a-vis the Indians, but they also put them on what would have become the most fertile rice fields in the colony. There were several small towns. Jamestown on the Santee eventually failed. But when South Carolina got a parish system for political reasons, That became the local congressional district, or House district, if you would. The area along the Santee was named St. Thomas and St. Denis, and they used the French spelling of Denis, D-E-N-I-S, Denis, and they also required that the Anglican priest in that parish had to be a French speaker. So they acknowledged at least that there were some differences. Now, the Huguenots became assimilated fairly quickly. Part of it was almost forced. When South Carolina had its first elections for what they called a parliament, today we would call the House of Representatives, Craven County, where the Huguenots lived, all 6 of their representatives were Huguenots. This upset the English majority, and what they did is, after this first session of Parliament, they merged Craven County with Berkeley County so that the English settlers in Berkeley County could outvote the French in Craven County. Now, the Frenchmen became Englishmen. Many of them joined the Anglican Church. They anglicized their names, and once rice production became the dominant source of wealth in the colony, the Huguenots along the Santee were among the greatest and richest of those planters. One of the earliest historians of the Huguenots in South Carolina, and this was written at the turn of the last century, said that by the time you got to the American Revolution, there was not a pure-blooded Huguenot living in South Carolina. Now, they had to endure some other hardships. They had a Huguenot church in Charleston, as you all know. Well, the times of worship were set by the local government, dominated by the English, so that if you wanted to come from the Santee to Charleston to worship, the time of worship was against the tide. So if you came to worship, you had to stay overnight. Eventually that was done away with, but that was just one of the ways that they could just do a little gig and make things uncomfortable. Probably encouraged a lot of folks to become Anglicans. Now, other French Protestants came, mostly Swiss. This is later in the 18th century, before we get to the American Revolution. New Bordeaux, over in the Savannah River Valley, was settled in the 1760s, especially along Long Cane Creek. It's about 40 miles above Augusta. And they planned to grow grapes and to raise silkworms. None of those worked very well, but the total migration to that settlement was in the hundreds, and that area of the state, New Bordeaux, certainly for many years had a French connection. Among the French names, particularly the Protestant Huguenots, include people like Henry Laurens, the Reverend Francis Lejeune, who was an Anglican priest, Hector Barrington de Beaufane, Peter Timothy, and such names as Mazique, Porcher, Horry, Hugy, Mott, Manigault, Cordes, Ravenel, Prelot, St. Julian's, Gilliard, Gendron, Gadine, Girard, and Marion. Names we still recognize today. Huguenots and English were the two major ethnic groups during the proprietary period, because at the end of the proprietary period, or towards the end of it, the proprietors closed the land office. And so no new settlers were welcomed or allowed to come in until after 1721. The Germans, as an ethnic group, they often called themselves Palatines because of the section of Germany that they came from. And you have German Swiss. And all of these were lumped together just simply as Germans. The first large group arrived in 1735, promised by 50 acres of land. Now, most of the party that came over that time were too poor to pay their passage, and so they sold their children and themselves into indentured servitude for 3 to 5 years. And they settled on Hard Labor Creek. That name derived from their having to be in indentured servitude. And when they paid off their debt, they called themselves redemptioners. The first large group settled in Orangeburg Township on the North Edisto. Many of those were German Swiss. Became prosperous farmers. They were industrious. And again, this is just like the Huguenots. When these strangers came, the government in Charleston pushed them to the frontier, in this case, the western frontier, to protect them against Indians. But some of the best and most arable regular farmland in the state, not rice fields, but traditional farmland, which would become part of the Cotton Belt, Orangeburg County, Orangeburg Township, where they gradually acquired slaves and they planted wheat, so that by the time of the Revolution, South Carolina not only produced enough wheat for domestic use, it was exporting wheat to other colonies. Other Germans settled in Saxagotha Township, present-day Lexington County, and in the 1740s, they thanked the Assembly for raising them from their depressed condition in Germany. And the Low Country owed them something as well, because these settlers in Saxagotha were the first line of defense against the Cherokee, and they would suffer when the Cherokee War broke out in the 1760s. Now, one of the interesting name issues with regard to the German settlers is this part of the state we call the Dutch Fork. Well, anybody who's been in the Columbia area for a long time knows that there's Dutch Square Mall. One of the first big shopping centers, goes back to the 1960s. Well, when it was developed, their big deal was, this is Dutch Square. They put tulips everywhere, they put windmills. They actually invited the Princess Royal from the Netherlands to come over and open it. And then my longtime friend and colleague, Professor Dan Hollis, pointed out that, no, not Dutch from the Netherlands. It was named from a corruption of the German phrase Deutsch Volk, which means German people. That evolved into Dutch Fork. They continued to use the windmills, but the princess said, thank you, but I'm not coming over. Among the names familiar from those German settlers, one of the most successful was Michael Carl Tyson, who controlled the drayage business in Charleston, the great portrait painter Jeremiah Theus, and the names that dot the Midlands area. We call it Geiger. It's spelled Geiger. That's another one of those names. Here it's Geiger, in Virginia it's Geiger. It is everywhere else, but Schuler, Harmon, Hutto, Amaker, Inhabitant, Ziegler, Wanamaker, Boozer, Sheely, Wingard, Lever, Lorick, and so forth. These names are still with us today. And on maps done of South Carolina as late as the 1950s, of religious preference in a particular county, the majority in a county, they colored it according to denomination. And Laurens, Newberry, Lexington, and Orangeburg were colored purple, where Lutherans were the largest single majority. Not majority, but the largest single religious denomination right after World War II. After the English, in terms of numbers, the second largest group were the Scots. Not Scots-Irish, or certainly not Scotch-Irish. As I tell folks, they're Scots. Scotch is something that you drink, okay? And the Scots-Irish, who were Scots, didn't have any Irish in them, traveled down the Great Wagon Road from Pennsylvania to the backcountry of Carolina, settling in a broad band, basically from the Waxhaws all the way over to Abbeville County. And it brought with them some of the sturdiest frontier folk that South Carolina had. Now, the Scots-Irish were not beloved by the people in the Low Country. There was an Anglican clergyman, Charles Woodmason, who traveled the backcountry to try to Christianize the heathen Scots-Irish. And he described their settlement at the Waxhaws: "A finer body of land is nowhere seen, but it is occupied by a set of the most lowest, vilest crew breathing, Scots-Irish Presbyterians from the north of Ireland." And my late colleague Dan Hollis, who was a Presbyterian, said that he knew another phrase, and that was, the Scots-Irish settlers kept the Ten Commandments and anything else they could get their hands on. Among the names you would associate with that Scots-Irish migration would be Calhoun, Caldwell, Bratton, Ross, Adams, Chalmers, Montgomery, Wardlaw, Logan, Jackson. And they were fierce frontiersmen. These were the folks who not only fought the Native Americans in two Cherokee wars, this is the bulk of the men who ended up winning the War for Independence in South Carolina, in the backcountry. But that's a story for another day. Now, the other Scots who came, pure Scots, as they were quick to say, not Scots-Irish, small in numbers. They settled primarily in Charleston, and two things spurred that Scottish migration. One was the Act of Union, which created Great Britain for the first time, and so Scots were then granted any privileges of any Englishman within the empire. And the Battle of Culloden in 1746, the last time that Bonnie Prince Charlie tried to regain the Scottish throne. Again, these were merchants, they were skilled traders, they were probably too good. They were considered sharp businessmen, and particularly right after the American Revolution. They were Presbyterian to the core, for the most part, but there were a few Scots Anglicans. And these names in Charleston started out, they're now everywhere. Pringle, Days, and again, that's our pronunciation of D-E-A-S. Everywhere else, it's D's. Pringle, Days, Abercrombie, Allen, Buchanan, Bullock, Kinlaw, K-I-N-L-O-C-H, Kinlaw, and Logan. Now, what about those mysterious Italians? Other than my friend Larry Rowland, who is the historian of Beaufort County, who has traced one or two families back, we don't really know anything other than we can now say that there were Italians in South Carolina, which actually makes sense. If you're taking individuals from Switzerland, the French and German and the Italians are all mixed up, so that it makes sense that some would come over. And then we've got Swedes, who came from the lower counties of Pennsylvania, which were Delaware. And they were small in number. Another group that was small in number were the Welsh Baptists, who also came down from that area of what we now call Delaware. And the Swedes came with them. And those folks have been identified through ethnographic studies. You won't find many people in the PD claiming that they're descended from Swedes. They'll talk about being descended from Welsh. But again, they were all mixed in together. Now, there were regular Irish, who came over in the 1760s as part of a bounty act to import more Protestants. A lot of them were not, and it was an incredibly nasty part of our state's history. Slave merchants like Henry Lawrence said that those immigrant ships were worse than the slave ships, and on one or two ships, almost all the immigrants died en route coming out to South Carolina. But about 3,000 of Irishmen came over in the 1760s. Such names as Wilson, Lemon, Presley, and Plowden and McRae are all Irish. One of the most interesting groups that came out was the Jewish population. They were Sephardic, that is, they were from Western Europe, not from Eastern Europe, which are Ashkenazic. And again, they were welcome here because under South Carolina's fundamental constitutions, the principle was a belief in God. Jews obviously believe in God, and they were welcomed here. In fact, in 1750, enough folks were settled in Charleston that there actually was a plan for a mass Jewish immigration to one of the backcountry townships. It never materialized, but that actually was on the board. Moses Lindo, who was an expert on indigo, became a crucial part of South Carolina's economy when that became our major crop. And Francis Salvador, who became the first person of Jewish faith to be elected to a parliamentary body in the Western world. He was elected to one of our revolutionary assemblies in 1775 and was killed in some of the first action of the American Revolution. And the old Charleston Jewish names, Cohen, Tobias, and DaCosta, are still with us today. Now, ethnic groups formed social and philanthropic associations to help one another. St. Andrew's Society for the Scots, although they weren't pure, they invited the Cherokee chieftain Attakulla to become a member. St. George's Society for the English, the South Carolina Society for the Huguenots, the German Friendly Society, the Hibernian Society for the Irish, and that was a 19th century successor for an earlier group. So that's quite a heterogeneous population in colonial South Carolina. Of the European settlers, English were barely 1/3 of the white population. But despite all of the mix, this still was very much an English colony. English was the language of business. The Church of England was the established church. And for various reasons, immigrants tried to become good Englishmen. Even the proud Huguenot, Henry Lawrence, and he was very proud of his Huguenot ancestry, referred to England as home. And so you can see with those 10 European ethnic groups that South Carolina really and truly was multicultural before multicultural became cool.